Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Arnie Lukes here at the Crossroads, and I'd like to welcome my two guests from the other side of the world. Welcome, Mark Anderson.
Great to be here, Arnie. Thank you.
No worries, pleased to have you, Mark. And Wallace Klinck from Canada. Welcome, Wallace.
Mm. Well, good to be with you, Arnie, from the other side of the world.
It is the other side of the world, that's right. I'm going to touch on some websites, and I'll just give you a sort of if you like, a runaround of these websites in order to lay the groundwork for today's discussion. The first website is our own Freedom Potentials podcast. We did midweek this week, and in regard to podcast episode 4, we were talking about BlackRock as an entity over and above central banks. And of course, to me, the big ticket in this is the exposing the financial core of the transnational capitalist class, which the link is there. I'll go to it. So global research, the financial core, naming the particular entities, if you like, and the directorships. Very important, not for us to focus on them as such, to go into depth, but to recognise that they are there. Now, the Thinking Housewife, which is I really am pleased to go there. They're doing a very good job. And the website itself is presenting an article in regard to the World Economic Forum and referring to it as the Great Reset. The Great Reset. So let's go to this World Economic Forum and COVID Action Platform. And we followed the link down here, otherwise the Strategic Intelligence Platform. And here you have this illustration of this image. And you can click on these links wherever, and it will actually start to decipher the actual structure that it's illustrating to you, the structure of what I consider to be world government. And this is very important. It's important in the sense that these people are of the view that they have control of the world and that you will do as you're told and you will adhere to this structure. And I'd certainly like to hear your thoughts in regard to this proposed new structure. Mark Anderson.
Thanks, Arnie. Yeah, it's notable that the Bilderberg meetings are not going to happen anytime soon. They actually postponed their 2020 meeting, the first disruption of a Bilderberg meeting since 1976 when Prince Bernhard had the Lockheed scandal. And with Bilderberg not meeting, the kind of open wing of the closed Bilderberg meetings is, in some respects, the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. So Bilderberg is in the background now. They've stepped aside. They've postponed their 2020 meeting. And now the World Economic Forum seems to be flexing its muscle more. And COVID-19 was just the leverage and that's their word, leverage that they needed. And so they're stepping forth with this manifesto, if you will, called the Great Reset. And the biggest problem I see with it right out of the starting gate is it has a lot of nice sounding and intriguing sounding pronouncements and ideas and goals. But then if you keep reading and if you listen to the founder, Klaus Schwab, who's also a Bilderberg Steering Committee member, the founder of the World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab, and if you listen to Prince Charles, who's also involved in this, what you see is that everything has to adhere to the strategic or sustainable development goals, that is, the SDGs of the United Nations. That's a huge red flag because that means that rather than this being a freedom thing, it's a worldwide, global, regimented thing, because to adhere to the sustainable development goals of the UN and Agenda 2030, that would micromanage and regiment businesses and daily life and human behavior to a very strong degree. If that was not there, we might be able to talk about freedom and liberty a little more. But since that is there, it's very problematic. And that's the big problem I see at this initial juncture here as we discuss this.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you so much for that, Mark. That's certainly an illustrative description of your thoughts on that World Economic Forum and essentially world government. I'm keenly interested in your take on this. Wallace Klinck, please.
Well, I try to go back to basics. I mean, things happen because of initiative. An initiative does not come from some kind of an amorphous mass organization. It comes from individuals. When you go back far enough, initiative and creativity comes to individuals. Now, should the activities and the fruits of initiative be under the domination or control of some abstract organization, it seems to me that we are designed to operate on a basis of initiative expressed and worked out under certain express and unique circumstances according to the individuals who actually bring it about. So if you're going to put the whole world under some kind of a constricted control or plan of some group of people who probably are more involved in abstract activities than they are in realistic activities, I think you are, just from the question of its nature, you're going into a very problematic and dangerous situation. And then when you take into consideration the question of human psychology and the dynamics of power and historical examples of what happens when you get power that is separated from the function, but controls the function, separated from the original intent of a function, and then it diverts and controls and
Okay, we've just happened to have lost Wally, so I'm just going to cut back here to Mark just to recover and see if Wally can't come back. I think it's very important what Wally's talking about, because he's relating the, if you like, the purpose behind or the intent behind any sort of structure, any sort of entity whatsoever, in regard to something like, say, people coming together to form community, or even as simple as a family. You come together in agreement and in an environment that's conducive to foster the well-being of the individuals concerned and, of course, the future progeny in the family. Community is exactly the same. You come together as a community to derive benefit. You're essentially laying that out on the table as grounded in, if you like, the philosophy of freedom. That is that working together, freely working together, people can actually exercise more initiative, be more creative, and actually harness or harvest an increment in that association. Nations are formed slowly and progressively over time. They're formed on the basis that communities come together and they form, if you like, first thing may be a border. It may be to stop the other tribes coming in, the other nations, if you like, coming in. So it's part of mutual protection, but it's also for mutual benefit. And so I think this is very important that we start considering these things in the nature of our thoughts. Now, Wally, I see you back, and you partway through you were talking about functions, so I'm going to give you the floor.
Well, functions are the way in which we accomplish things. And if you're going to have constant interference with a function by people who really are not directly involved with it, either conceptually or practically, they're out of order, and they're going to damage the function. It will not do what it was intended to do or what it should do. And the further you get power or direction away from the center of the activity, the more unrealistic they're likely to be. And also considering themselves to be qualified in this respect, the more arrogant, the more dictatorial they're going to be. It's just in the nature of things. You can ascribe it to human personality, intent, and motive, but it is also just an inevitable consequence of that type of organization. It's inappropriate.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I really appreciate that. Thank you so much, Wally. It's very, very important to consider that there are limits to what one person can do. There are, if you like, intelligence limits. They can only manage so many irons in the fire. I know at times that sometimes I bite off more than I can chew, and I realise I'm losing control of all of these things because I've got too much on my plate. Now, this is only in my own home. I have too many tasks that are going on in my own home, and that's the limit to me in order to do those things that I wish to do well. And so I have to break out and concentrate on them one at a time. And I can relate it to the real world. Now, it's very important that we consider how things work out in the real world. What the abstraction perhaps may be the thought. You may have if you like, a vision of something, and when you put it into practice, you've got to actually gauge it. You've got to see how it outworks in the real world. Otherwise, it's only an abstraction. It's only a thought. It's only a dream. It's not real. And in the case of, if you like, the ultimate absentee landlord, here we've got an entity or a structure that wishes to rule the entire world. Now, what the dickens do those people in those positions know about my backyard? What do they know about the needs of my children or grandchildren? What do they know about how to rear stock in a back paddock, or the management of my chooks or my fruit trees, or how I'm going to get on with my neighbour? They wouldn't have a clue. How the dickens can they manage something like that so remotely? And of course, these things have to be micromanaged. They have to be actually placed at the foot of the individual. The individual must choose to do those things that they consider best. They are the resident expert. And of course, this level of bureaucracy is one of totalitarianism. It's from its very conception, it's one of ruling the entire world. Your thoughts, please, Mark Anderson.
Yeah, Arnie. And no matter how soft pedal it is, no matter how much they dress it up in freedom, by its very nature, based on what you and Wallace said, it cannot be anything other than hard or medium or soft totalitarianism. The word totalitarian means total or absolute rule. Like Mussolini said, nothing above the state, nothing against the state, nothing outside the state. And that's what it would be. And however benevolent they feel their intentions are, it's still top down rather than bottom up. And that seemed to be what you were both alluding to.
Yeah.
The only just society is from the bottom up, not the top down. Something resembling subsidiarity in Catholicism, for example, the subsidiarity principle, where it starts with the individual and the family, and it moves up to the community, and onward up to the nation state, and you have your your spiritual elements. And as you said, Arnie, societies start with families or clans or tribes, and they move up, and you might establish a border and establish a nation. But then if you take a bureaucracy and a committee of secretive, semi-secretive, or nominally open bureaucrats and bankers and journalists who really have abandoned the principles of journalism and are colluding with people in power rather than reporting on them, and some celebrities and former and current heads of state and finance ministers, pretty soon you have something called the World Economic Forum. Mm-hmm. And they meet every year in Davos in January, and they outline all these things. And it is largely a bunch of abstractions. And I noticed when I listened to their recent videos, there's kind of a battery of videos out there featuring Klaus Schwab and others. They speak in such generalities, it's very difficult for them to get to specifics. And that's something that should raise a red flag for all of us when somebody speaks in vague generalities and guarded kind of cryptic language, and they never really get into specifics. And that right there is enough for me to say, thanks, but no thanks, guys. We'll manage our own affairs. Thank you very much. And also, when you listen to like a guy named Ma Jun, who's head of the chairman of the China Green Finance Committee, which is associating with the Great Reset. He said, well, it's great that people are getting COVID-19 related stimulus checks. They need the the stimulus. They need to be kept afloat financially. And I have no argument with him there in that specific sense. But then he said, well, maybe we need to find something for these stimulus recipients to do. Well, we need to plant millions of trees. So if someone receives a stimulus check, they should go out and plant trees. Well, what that sounds like to me, however subtly it's being pitched, is a species of indentured servitude, or what could become forced labor. And so, would the World Economic Forum, and I'm just asking the question, I don't know the answer, would they have us be in one of Mao's labor groups, like in Mao Zedong's days when they had forced labor, and you would gladly do your labor for the central state or central command? Because that's part of your agreement, you might say. And so if they advocate giving us stimulus, which can be a good thing if it's done right, but then they turn around and say, well, you owe labor for the stimulus, that there's no free lunch, then that runs against the social credit credo or social credit philosophy that us three believe in, the proper kind of social credit, not the wrong kind. And so that right there, as suggested by this Chinese delegate or member of the Great Reset, that suggests that in the back of their mind, they see some sort of indentured servitude. It's not conclusive what I'm saying, but again, they're not conclusive either. They don't provide a lot of specifics, so you have to read the tea leaves to a degree. And Klaus Schwab, I'll mention before I hand the gavel back to you guys, Klaus Schwab mentioned sending 10,000 global shapers, his words, 10,000 global shapers into 400 or more communities in the world to explore these issues. So evidently they're sending delegates or correspondents out throughout the world to study things. Now that could yield some good knowledge. They might learn some good things. They might be good people on an individual level. They might have benevolent intentions, but I think their structure very likely would override whatever good intentions they have, because it cannot help but be centralized and all roads lead to Davos type thing. So this is the thing. It's inherently anti-freedom, no matter how pro-freedom they want to make it, in my view.
Yeah, no, thank you for that, Mark. It's a very important observation. Freedom. Where do the roots of freedom come from? In my mind, they come from a philosophy of the Christian religion, in that statements like the kingdom of God is within you. The kingdom is within you. All power and authority. Where does it vest? Does it vest in you? Does it vest in God? Does it invest in another man? Does it actually vest in another man? Davos is saying it does. It's saying that they, as a group, authority vests in them. They're saying that their philosophy is one of that they are, if you like, the more equal. George Orwell's 1984, more equal than the others. Some are more equal than others. And of course, that sort of perspective, these more equal, have a right to rule the world. They have a right to govern you, to decide what you can and can't do, and where you shall go and where you shan't go, and what you shall speak and what you shan't speak, and what you shall think and what you shan't think. And that is quite a profound consideration, that the power vests in them and not in you over these things. And you say, well, okay, I've got my stipend, I've got my payment from the government, so I can tolerate this. And for some time, perhaps you can. But in the end, there is something inherent deeply within you, and that is the right or the choice, the opportunity to choose to do things. And if you lose that opportunity, then you're no more than a slave. Even if you're a kept slave, you're still no more than a slave or a chattel that are at the, if you like, the beck and call of others. And this is the question you've actually got to ask and concentrate on. What is my philosophy? Am I a free, dependent but somewhat independent and unique individual who has the capacity to think and to utter those thoughts and to act independently and self-reliantly? Am I this, or am I just some sort of putty to be manipulated by an other entity who is more equal than me? Your thoughts, please, Wallace Klinck.
Well, it's quite a tub full of considerations, I must say. It's it's just an inevitable thing that he who pays the piper calls the tune, and especially in this kind of a dispensation, economic dispensation, where no one has a universal inheritance. Even though we're born into a universe, into a world that has the basis of existence, we are not able to gain access to it unless we work. And when you work, no matter how nice your boss may be, you are going to be under his direction, and you will be required to do what he says if you wish to partake of the results of the activity. In other words, your security depends upon compliance. Now, if this were the way the universe was, I guess you'd have to accept it, but that's not the way the universe is. The universe, actually, in nature, living organisms have access to all sorts of the means of subsistence and existence without necessarily, bowing to anyone else's will or any other conscious force. So, I mean, we were really, what we've done in this economic system that we have created, we have really debased the whole nature of human existence, the nature of human beings themselves, because they do not possess the freedom to think, the freedom to act that they're capable of and that they should be able to do. Now, that's his value judgment, but I think it's certainly not, it's beyond argument from our standpoint that people should have those freedoms, not to impinge unfavorably upon others, but to independently exercise their own potentialities and creativities. So we've really created a dreadful situation. It's having now, for instance, we just had a case, I understand, in the province of Quebec, where a family went up the river somewhere, and they had, I think there were about something like upwards of 20 of them or so, and they had some kind of a family celebration. Well, what happened? The breathing police came along and noticed that they weren't using masks. And evidently, they all got, I think it was an $800 fine. Now, if that is voluntary activity or voluntary compliance, I wouldn't want to know what anything worse would be. I mean, can you imagine? And I know that there is considerable debate about the desirability about these masks. They can be damaging to your health over the long term, certainly, but the thing has been terribly damaging to us from a material standpoint and with regard to the economy too. I mean, the damage that has been done is just absolutely colossal. I have heard, I don't know, Arnie, maybe you know about it, but I've heard that there is an enormous docket of cases that are awaiting action in the Australian courts over this whole thing. So, this is not something that was inconsequential. It's had drastic effects for human beings, for young people, for babies, for children, for teenagers, for young adults, for the aged. And I don't see that anybody is in a conspicuous place to bear responsibility for it.
Yeah.
They're more or less just declaring that they're doing the right thing for everybody, according to their opinion or their stated opinion.
Yeah. Yeah. No,
and I really don't think that, they may talk about this all being voluntary and all this sort of thing, but when you listen to them and you hear the things that come out from time to time, it's obvious that the intent must be forced compliance. And if that's forced compliance with, say, this particular issue, they will not hesitate to use forced compliance wherever they choose, ultimately.
Yeah. Yeah, no, thank you for that, Wallace. I think it's profoundly important for us to look again at this structure, because this is not something that is spontaneous. This is not something that has just occurred. This is an entity, if you like, that has profound implications, and it has gone to great depths to actually even the development of this illustration. This isn't something that you're going to actually just get off the shelf and there it is, it's going to work. In order to design that illustration and get it to work and be dynamic like that is an enormous amount of intellect. So planning has gone into it. And in my view, just to build that particular website, I would suggest months and months and months, if not years of planning, just to build that website. And let alone to actually think through the design behind it and the intent behind it. So if you're an individual who doesn't believe in conspiracy or conspiring or the secret intentions behind organisations, I think you're delusional. I think that this is a clear indication that the intention or purpose behind Davos, behind world government, and the objective, even if COVID-19 was real, which I have my doubts, but if it was real, it's certainly been taken advantage of. But I believe it played directly into the hands of entities such as this to bring about what their intention, to bring about their purpose, the policy behind the design, the purpose, the intent, world government. Your thoughts, please, Mark Anderson.
Yes, Arnie, this of course brings into sharp focus Event 201 held in New York City in mid-October of 2019, some 2 to 3 months before the coronavirus COVID-19 surfaced and emerged and became this dreadful household name, symbolizing arbitrary control, mysterious death counts that you can't rely on, mysterious case counts you can't rely on, testing that is very likely not accurate. But in that Event 201, it was a simulation of a coronavirus outbreak, again in October of 2019, well before COVID-19 actually happened. And the World Economic Forum, along with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, founded by Bloomberg, that is, the Bloomberg outfit, Michael Bloomberg, put on Event 201, and they posted videos. You can go online and see this, but they planned and contemplated economic and social and political scenarios and outcomes, the impact of coronavirus, that is, and those economic impacts and outcomes eerily resemble the actual outcomes that we're experiencing now and that both you and Wallace just referred to. The way the economy is being tanked by this fear and wearing masks and all this. So there's the World Economic Forum back in October, joining up with Bill and Melinda Gates, joining up with Johns Hopkins and the medical outfit there, having this simulated drill about a zoonotic coronavirus. Zoonotic means animal-based, I guess. And what are the odds that the real thing would happen just a couple months later? Now, I cannot absolutely prove that, but it's really infinitesimal in my mind. And as you said, Arnie, the amount of thinking and planning to put together that model, that circular model, that kind of pie chart, if you will, a very detailed graphic there, and it's an active web thing. They're doing an active web application there. A lot of planning, a lot of thinking went into that. And so with the World Economic Forum's name on that event 201, certainly it's something that Sherlock Holmes would like to take a close look at. And I think that the people that put that event on have a lot of explaining to do. And I'll mention in passing that when they did that simulation, they even went into, well, what are we going to do about people online, citizen journalists and alternative media and quote unquote conspiracy theorists that might, you know, take exception or analyze or become suspicious of what we're doing. That was discussed at their simulation. So if it was just a basic simulation about a coronavirus outbreak, why would they anticipate citizens and alternative media objecting to it or being suspicious of it during the simulation? You see, so it's very, very close to being a smoking gun. At the very least, it's something that I think would hold up in a court of law as an exhibit if someone were to get, legally involved in investigating this. I think it at least has standing or would have standing to be an exhibit in a court of law. So there you go. The World Economic Forum is, they've got their fingerprints on a lot of things in a lot of places that raise suspicions, rather deep suspicions at that. So I think that's very important to point out.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Mark, and I thank you for it. We're well into the show, and okay, so we're looking at this entity and we're analysing it and we're taking it into account, but we've actually got to go further than that. I presented a case of essentially what philosophy does the individual hold, and is it a philosophy of freedom or one of actually dominance, hierarchy and subservience, if you're like a chattel slave. And on the basis of the philosophy, if you like the philosophy of freedom, there's got to be a response. And is it a standing army? Is it just this mega leader that's going to challenge them? Or is it actually the individual? Is it you? Is it me who's going to actually cause this chain of events to actually unravel? And I think it's a very, very important consideration, because individual initiative, you don't know what you can do. You don't know your limitations. You don't know your capabilities. And in the, if you like, the trenches of warfare, it's where the individual in there, that predicament, reaches into the very core of their humanity and decides to do something that is only within them. It's within them. It's the actual spirit of freedom that is within their very heart of hearts. They decide to pursue this goal and go after it. And to me, that core, that spirit, that spark of vitality that is in the individual is the very thing that is capable of overcoming this power. It is that individual. And you've got to look at it and you've got to consider and take, if you like, take up your own cross. What is it that I can do? It is the very thing that I now must do. Your thoughts, please, Wallace Klinck.
Well, I think that C.H. Douglas, the founder of social credit, said that neither social credit nor Christianity has ever been tried. And every effort is being and will be made to ensure that neither are tried, because these people fear more than anything else creative initiative coming from the people themselves. They fear it, and that's why they have devoted so much energy, so much effort into attempting to discredit anyone who suggested that activities were going on that were not necessarily benevolent. And so, I mean, the thing of it is, let's be realistic. This whole thing about being a conspiracy theorist is intended to do one thing. It's intended to make you look weak, foolish, irrational, and non-credible. That's what it's all about. Now, why would anybody be so really anxious to stress this particular question. And somebody must have something to hide. Of course, there's a conspiratorial mind at work again, you see. But the thing of it is, conspiracies have been going on. Go back in history, back to the Middle Ages, back to Roman and Greek times. And I mean, history is a chronicle of conspiracies. In other words, a conspiracy is when more than two people get together to enact some policy without being candid with the people that are being affected about what the policy, that it exists and what it's about and what it's intended for. You know, it's a question of basic honesty. And anyone who says that people are foolish because they're conspiracy-minded is just simply dishonest or ill-educated. They simply don't know what life is all about. They have the foggiest notion. But I think that the people in this world who wield power know very well the importance of discrediting the idea in the minds of the people that maybe something are being done that are not necessarily really that well intended for the benefit of people at large. So, I mean, if you can convince your victim that you are benign and of no danger, well, you've affected your policy right there without even having to do very much further. I mean, you have put in the mindset of the people that people who are suspicious are not reliable, they're not creditable, and therefore they will start criticizing. There's sort of a self-sustaining motions set in place where people actually tend to discredit themselves without anyone having to really do much to bring it about. People just get into the frame of mind where anyone who asks questions is just a troublemaker and just completely out of order and not stable. So, I mean, anyone who imagines that conspiracies have not and do not exist in the world is just simply living in a dream world. They do. And it's best that everybody knows about them and what they are and who is behind them. It's essential because it's essential to our survival.
No worries. Thank you so much for that, Wallace. I was reading an article, I think it was this morning, could have been late last night, and it was written by Eric Butler. And when he wrote it, he was talking about another article and essentially a conspiracy of perhaps 300 people at the top of this apex, top of this pyramid of power. And of course, that goes back, I think it was in the 50s that Eric wrote it. It goes back that this is long standing. That was 70 years ago. You've got to consider the ramifications of policy, the outworking of policy. And if you sort of place events in perspective, you realize that there is design or purpose behind it. COVID-19 has, as an example, has not caused the mortality rate, the morbidity rate that it was supposed to. It's nothing like it. I think its morbidity is less than a seasonal flu. But what it has caused, or what it has created, is a significant shutdown in the economy, a significant balk in people thinking and rationally trying to comprehend what is actually going on. This is essentially a turning the world upside down. If there is an infectious disease, you isolate those who are infectious. You don't isolate the whole world. They've turned the world upside down, and it's done by edict. It's done by proclamation, not by parliament, not by debate, not by representation, but rather, if you like, supposedly a chief scientist. And I find that extraordinary, that they're doing exactly the opposite that their science would suggest to them. Exactly the opposite. So it's not holding water in my view. we're at the 40-minute mark, which is it's an interesting forum, and it's a pity we won't go on. But I know that there's a limit to each batch, if you like, batch of information. So I'm going to call for closing comments and summary, please, Mark Anderson.
Well, I think it's important to note that the riots going on so heavily in the United States and somewhat in Canada and trickling into other parts of the world where they're tearing down historical figures and founding figures of different nations, particularly the US, are based on a lot of somewhat justified anger. People do sense, apart from the violence that's never justified, people do sense that there's a vast injustice and inequity in the world. And even the Economic Forum, the World Economic Forum in Davos, at least to their credit, acknowledges that in the fourth industrial revolution, human labor is becoming less and less and less of a factor in production. And they have flirted with the universal basic income, that idea. Is it part of the Great Reset? It probably is. Of course, they would base it on transferring money from the tax till, redistributing the money rather than distributing it, robbing Peter to pay Paul, and doing it based on a debt-based system, which is the wrong way to go. So that would be the right idea, but the wrong approach. So there's a lot of people that have justified anger and concerns, and they sense something is dreadfully wrong. But with shows like this, we get around the mass media and we tell people why things are the way they are as best we can. And as clearly as we can, we tell them what the solutions very likely would be. And that involves all of us to get educated and exercise our individual initiative, but come together and understand what's going on. And I'll simply add that I think that the riots also were designed to address the COVID-19 thing one more time. I think there's, with the George Soros money and the Open Society Foundations financing some of the leaders of these riots, and them having a national or international Marxist philosophy behind them, kind of a new Bolshevism, Bolshevism 2.0, you might say. The Bolsheviks are back. With that comes the idea that the riots would be used to overcome the protests that were beginning to build against COVID-19. Every day there was more and more protests against the COVID-19 lockdown, and these new Bolsheviks use this with their clandestine financing to sidetrack and overwhelm and eclipse those genuine protests against the lockdown. And I think that was part of it, not just to wreak havoc toward their Marxist philosophy and their Marxist goals in tandem with George Soros and their financiers, but also to knock off the tracks and to disrupt the real, honest, genuine anti-lockdown protests that were beginning to happen. So I think that we can see around the corner on the COVID-19 discussion today and see that they saw that real protests by real people were really beginning to take hold against COVID-19, and they had to do something about it, and hence the riots. So they're killing several birds with one stone. So I would conclude with that for now.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. Excellent observation, Mark. There are moves afoot, if you like, in one of the states in Australia. There are moves afoot against the Victorian government because they're continuing on with their lockdown policy. They're increasing testing. They're increasing, let's get this clear, they're increasing testing. So obviously the results will continue to climb as they increase test, but morbidity is not increasing. Morbidity is of no consequence. So the numbers that they're throwing up are spurious numbers in order to distract us and confuse us as to what's going on. They don't want to let go of this power. Once they've seized it, they don't want to let go because, yes, they are Bolshevik by nature. And interesting that the Bolshevik government in Victoria has an avowed Marxist in the heart of the Melbourne seat, an avowed Marxist, the only green politician in the lower house, an avowed Marxist. I understand if preferences were spread, over 80% of the first preference votes go to Bolshevism And that's just absolutely incredible. It's an undoing of the Australian spirit, a consequence of the, if you like, the education streams coming from a university city like Melbourne. Your thoughts and closing comments, please, Wallace Klinck.
Yes, Arnie, I think the people who have run the show for so many decades, centuries, simply can't control the situation according to the type of administration they have previously had. They're losing control. But Douglas said that the financial system, because of its non-self-liquidating nature and dependence upon increasing debt, would simply become unsustainable according to the conventional ways of doing things. And he also said there would be some very unpleasant sequences in human existence on account of it. And so I think that there's no doubt at all that they have concluded that the time is ripe for a bold move toward increasing centralization of world power. And I think they're being almost forced by their own policies into it, unless they change their objective, which has been power, the aggregation of power. So, I don't think there's any doubt at all that this is an accelerated program, perhaps even somewhat beyond what they originally intended. But in any case, it is a very, very damaging, destructive, and ominous development because it is not bringing human happiness. And we do know, I think as Mark may have implied, people like the Rockefellers and others who have been involved in this sort of thing are, for some reason or another, they're hostile to the idea of the human race continuing to expand. Not only that, they have made it very clear that they want to reduce the human population. Well, maybe they should start with themselves. So you can see that, yes, it's not an accident. Maybe it's brought about a bit prematurely, but I think it's being accelerated, and I think that it will be persisted in. And I think we're going to have to be very, very alert and very courageous and very active in encountering it, because it can lead to no good. Centralization of power. What happened to the Roman Empire? It was a great empire, but it collapsed upon itself because of excess taxation and debt and great landifundia, the big land farming areas that simply crowded out the smaller operators. A lot of things are really quite comparable in a way, because and money played, we understand, a major role in the whole thing, the debasement of the currency, inflation, and so on. So I don't know. We've got, I think that we have in the social credit a most remarkable approach. And I think that it definitely deserves an opportunity to be given a chance to prove itself. And if we don't do it, then we simply, well, I guess we just quit by default. And civilization may end, we don't know.
No worries. Thank you so much for that. It's a if you like, an accurate observation, and it is before us all. The solution, it's fascinating. The solution is one of freedom. It's choosing freedom. That is the solution. It's got a name. It's called Douglas Social Credit, where policy is based on the philosophy of Christianity. I'm not going to go any further. I think we've covered the ground very well today, and I thank you, gentlemen, for the valuable input and assessment of the state of play, the Great Reset. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Arnie.